The following program is a UWTV classic.
Rock and roll from a social and political perspective. A conversation with rock writer Mikal Gilmore next on Upon Reflection.
From the University of Washington in Seattle, Upon Reflection.
I'm Ross Reynolds. Welcome to Upon Reflection. From Elvis to Kurt Cobain, rock has been the music of youth and rebellion. But when the biggest concerts are by 50-something musicians like the Rolling Stones, Bob Dylan, and Van Morrison, where are the youth? And when even a song like the Beatles' Revolution is adapted for a TV commercial, does rebellion stand a chance? Rock journalist Mikal Gilmore grapples with the place of rock music in our hearts and in our culture in his collection of essays titled Night Beat. Mikal Gilmore has been writing about the music for 24 years for Rolling Stone, the Los Angeles Times, and other publications. Mikal Gilmore also wrote about the execution of his brother Gary Gilmore in the award-winning memoir Shot in the Heart. Mikal Gilmore, thanks very much for being with us on Upon Reflection.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You call Night Beat a shadow history of rock and roll. What do you mean by a shadow history?
What I wanted to do originally was write a formal history of rock and roll as a cultural eruption and movement in post-war American history. I had a lot of resistance to that idea from various publishers and editors. Generational histories are important. When you look at the generational histories of the 20s and 30s, or in particular the generational history of Second World War, they tell us not only about events, but about times that change how we have lived, how history is transformed, and how we have lived in time since. In my estimation, rock and roll was another cultural eruption that transformed an entire generation, not just its taste, but the way it lived and what the values and stakes were for the society around us. I couldn't get a publisher terribly interested in that story because the trend now is toward books that decry popular culture, books that stand for conservative values and that are almost refusal of whatever was unleashed in the 1960s. So my best option, or my next option, was to do a collection of my writings, and I did not intend at that point to try to transform that into a history. But as soon as I started to look through all the things I'd written, as soon as I signed on to do that book, I got discouraged because I realized, I've written about so many things over such a sprawl of time. How do I just pick the more recent things that are better written? Do I try to try to put things in a systematic order? And one night, with the grace of a couple glasses of wine, I was sitting looking at my list of the things I wanted to be sure to include, and then it just occurred to me, well, I could put this in, not in the order in which it was written, but I could put it in the order in which the events occurred, from Elvis Presley through the punk era, through Kurt Cobain, through Tupac Shakur, and that would be my stab, my version of a history. It's not a formal history. It's more like a shadow of a history.
You, like Robert Christgau, Lester Bangs, Robert Palmer, and some of the other writers about rock music, really transformed the way that popular culture, and particularly pop music, was dealt with in journalism. And before that, it seemed more as though it was dealt with in a teen magazine fashion, whereas your writing in this book really takes a look at the deeper impact of the music.
Well, first of all, it's very nice to be placed in the company of the people you just mentioned. And I would add people like Greil Marcus and Dave Marsh. Actually, I think of them more as my mentors. I think of those writers and people like Paul Williams, who started Crawdaddy. I think of those people as the people who really opened the doors for a new kind of criticism about rock and roll, looking at what it meant in our lives, what it meant in our culture, and then as the stakes for all that went along, then there was no choice but for journalists to raise the ante. I feel like I came in like second or third generation. I've met some of those people, had fun with them, known some of them. I've never felt that I was in their league, but I learned from my own experience of growing up with music that music could speak for you at moments in your life and give you a place where you could find comfort where perhaps nothing else would. But at the same time, I think that rock critics like Robert Palmer and Paul Nelson and Greil Marcus and so many others, Robert Christgau, I think that they did something that, at its best, was almost as good as the music. It showed us, it chronicled what the music was doing to the world around us and what it was doing to our hearts.
I agree with that, with both of those statements. You make an interesting point when you talk about a phrase that's often used in music. They talk about a band being as big as the Beatles.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And as big as the Beatles, as you point out, really is a phrase that doesn't have much meaning anymore. Why do you say that?
Well, I mean, in the 1960s when the Beatles erupted, I mean, there had been standards for what was big in popular culture and popular music, and the Beatles clearly very quickly, at least American culture and British culture, rose to a new level, a level that had been occupied by Elvis Presley beforehand, by Frank Sinatra, by Rudy Vallée, by Bing Crosby, by very few others. But and they also managed to occupy a center of popular taste, perhaps for the last time that has ever occurred in popular culture. To be bigger than the Beatles meant not just to sell more records, which is what the record companies often take it to mean and want it to mean. So in that case, somebody like Peter Frampton or Fleetwood Mac or many other people, Prince, Madonna, Bruce Springsteen, many other, Michael Jackson especially, have gone on to be bigger than the Beatles in the sense that they were bigger sellers. They had a larger audience. But in the sense of changing the world in such a way that that world could never really turn back, to transform what popular culture and popular music was and what it stood for. Popular music broke down into various camps after that, and there are people within those camps who have done that. To occupy that center that changed things so in such a worldwide way would be very hard. But certainly, you know, somebody such as Nirvana here from the Northwest did as much as the Beatles did in their own way for their era and their spirit of music.
The means of production and distribution of music have changed quite a bit since the Beatles became popular. There's so many other ways to get your music out, and that's part of the reason I think we see the scene fractured much more than it was in the earlier days. Is it possible for there to be another band within the context of rock and roll that could have such a revolutionary effect, a before and after effect, or will it take a entire new genre of music to overturn rock and roll?
I'd be surprised if it could ever happen at the level that it happened with somebody like the Beatles or Elvis Presley or the Rolling Stones or Bob Dylan or the Motown and Stax folk music of the '60s. Which is not to say that was the best music ever made. There's terrific music that's been made since, and there's terrific music that's being made now. But there have been so many lines drawn in the sand in the years since, in the late 1970s with punk and with disco. All of which tended to fragment audiences, and audiences still tend to be fragmented. I think it'd be very hard to unify the audience in the same way, but I think there are things now that matter just as much and that speak for audiences just as powerfully. You know, for example, in hip-hop music and rap music, a music that many people either fear or misunderstand, that is a valuable movement and a genuine culture that has grown up around a music that began in nightclubs and on the streets, and it has become a movement that has stood the test of time and will be around for a long time to come.
For many people my age in the mid-40s, we've gotten a little bit further away from the mania, the genuine enthusiasm we had for music in our early days, and that's caused me to wonder if enthusiasm about pop music isn't somehow linked to being young, if it's not part of a coming of age where you have that enthusiasm for the music, and as you get older, other things occupy your life, and necessarily music just becomes a smaller part of it. What do you think?
Well, I think that's a very good question. I mean, I think that is true in a large respect. Enthusiasm about popular music as it becomes the identity for who you are, the group of people you associate with, the values of your time, that can be a very valuable and exciting experience of youth. It's a rites of passage, and it was that way with rockabilly, and it was that way with psychedelia, and it was that way with punk, and it's been that way with hip-hop for many other people. But I think sooner or later a person figures out in their life whether or not music remains an ongoing pleasure or value or a source of meaning, or if it's something that sort of gets filed away in their life as a fad that they have pleasant feelings about. Either for better or worse, I became one of those people who stayed excited by what popular music continued to mean and say and produce, and how it continued to work, even though in many ways that changed. But it's well, as an example, about 2 weeks ago, I went to see Bob Dylan perform in Los Angeles. He did 5 nights there. Bob Dylan is somebody who was one of those people, in fact, one of the key people who really turned rock and roll and popular music upside down, and folk music, changed what it could say, changed what it could mean to the world and to an audience, and taught people the valuable lesson that that they could voice things for people that had not been voiced before. And yet that was 30 years ago, and that he really hit that dramatic peak. Now, in the years since, he's made much music, some of which was wonderful, some of which was less than wonderful, some of which seemed focused, some of which seemed misdirected. And so by this point, many people would assume that Bob Dylan is somebody who once meant something but could no longer be as vital as he once was. There's a certain way in which that is true. Bob Dylan cannot turn the world upside down again. But in 1997, Bob Dylan made one of the most resourceful, most intelligent, most moving albums of his career. Quite possibly the best album he has ever made. And the shows I saw in Los Angeles a couple of weeks ago, and I've seen him many, many times over the years, these were the best shows I've seen him perform. And I remember standing there during the last night that I watched him, thinking how fortunate and happy I felt to have grown up in a time where I've seen not only so many great movements come and go, but where I could see somebody who could also last over an entire generation or more and still be a vital artist.
One of the most provocative and interesting essays in Night Beat is one where you talk about what happened in 1984 when President Reagan was running for re-election, and he invoked the name of Bruce Springsteen in New Jersey, the perfect place to do it, and talked about Born in the USA as a song that evoked America's great dreams. Of course, a misreading of the song completely. If you read the lyrics, you realize that it's actually a very bleak song about contemporary American culture at that time. But you also wrote and asked the question, does dedication to rock and roll imply some kind of political involvement, and got responses from your readers. Could you talk about kind of how you answered that question and some of the perspectives you got on it?
It was a question I really had to ask myself when I wrote the piece about Springsteen and Ronald Reagan. I was appalled when Ronald Reagan invoked Bruce Springsteen's name. I saw them as two people who stood for opposite versions of America, very, very differing visions of what America was and what it should become. I thought in many ways Springsteen spoke to the heart of what had been lost, and spoke to many of the people who had been left aside from the American dream. I felt Ronald Reagan was ignoring that, was in fact stealing the American dream out from underneath people's feet in a very clever, in the clever manner of making people believe, in fact, he was restoring it. I think the legacy of Ronald Reagan has been absolutely ruinous for this country, and I think it will take us a long time, if we can, to repair what happened. But my values are clearly of the left, and my values were shaped, my political values were shaped in the 1960s when rock and roll was one of the forces of the left. So I had to ask myself that question, because I had a lot of letters from people who said, well, I love Bruce Springsteen, but I love Ronald Reagan. I'm going to vote for Ronald Reagan. I had many more letters that said that. And I just had to pause and ask myself, well, has this changed that much? Has rock and roll lost, the question is, has rock and roll lost that meaning, or has that meaning been transformed, or has rock and roll been opened up so much that it can now stand for whatever causes or voices people want to give it? I think I had to finally accept the latter answer, that rock and roll works best for the passions and beliefs of the people who make the music. At the same time, I think it still remains a music of disruption. I think it remains a music and a force that makes people very uncomfortable, whether it's somebody like Tupac Shakur, or it's a band like Prodigy or Marilyn Manson. It is still a music that works against the grain of a lot of what are seen as the proper values.
Well, a proper value in our culture is making money, and rock and roll music is considered a way to make money if it's at all successful. How do you combine that tension of the rebelliousness of rock and roll, the throwing over with the major corporations, the 6 major corporations actually, that put out virtually all of the music that we get to hear on the radio and that's available in stores? It's
a good question. I mean, that tension has been there for a long time. It is at times a dismaying spectacle to witness, and at times it's a valuable tension. I mean, back in the 1950s, it was the independent labels that put rock and roll on the map and made it force, and it was the major labels that eventually assimilated those labels, or some independent labels like Atlantic would go on to become major labels. Same thing happened in the late 1970s when the small labels put punk on the map, and eventually large corporations like Geffen or Warner Brothers or others came in and signed those bands or signed hip-hop bands. I mean, that question of whether this is a consumer product that's forced on the public, or whether it's a genuine, a genuine articulation of change and passion, is that question has always been there. I mean, today there's still a great deal of argument between the indie movement and what is seen as the corporate rock world. I don't think the questions are ever going to get resolved. I think in the last 20 years we've seen the independent world produce a lot of the movements that really have mattered, and we've seen the corporate world assimilate those and turn them into a kind of product. The problem I have now with both the independent world and the corporate world is that they are looking at artists too much in the short run. They are producing too many artists that are allowed to have one or two hits, and then once the artist breaks the mold, or once the artist produces a work that doesn't live up to the previous standard of sales, that artist starts to be forgotten. And I think that
But has that always been true for all but a few musicians like a Randy Newman that had the strong support of his label to continue to produce iconoclastic recordings?
It's always been true that there are people that are one or two hit wonders, or that have their small season. I mean, sometimes creativity is finite. The Bob Dylans and the Frank Sinatras are actually run against the grain. What I worry about is that turning people into one or two hit wonders seems to be what much of the music business is best at this point.
I'm also intrigued by the aesthetic of rock and roll, which values simplicity, values raw passion, and not necessarily well-trained voices. I mean, we hear a lot of music voices in rock and roll. You mentioned Bob Dylan that aren't wonderful voices. We hear primitive instrumentalism. Does rock and roll get away from its roots when it gets too classy? When you listen to a band like Steely Dan, which would be in the rock racks, you've got incredible technical proficiency going into the music. In your opinion, does that they make it less rock and roll? No, I mean, perhaps some of that music is not what would be defined as classic or definitive rock and roll, but rock and roll has shown that it can grow and it can produce sophisticated forms. From the Beatles to Steely Dan, to much of the music that somebody like Elvis Costello has made. I admit that for myself that sometimes that lacks a grit and a passion, or a quality of abrasion and mistake that I like in some of the more primitive sounds. But both those musics have their merits. I mean, there's a great deal of depth to the music that Steely Dan made. This was a big argument in the 1970s when the people when you would see somebody like The Clash pit it against somebody like Toto, the people on the Toto side would say, well, this isn't music, they can't play their instruments, they don't know their scales, and you would see the people on the punk side saying, well, that isn't music, it's all polished and it's lost all of its passion, and it has nothing to say. There's truth on both sides. You've had a chance to interview some really interesting people in music: Mick Jagger, Bob Dylan, Lou Reed. Are there one or two of them that particularly impressed you as people? Oh yeah, I mean they all impress you as people in one way or another. Sometimes to your surprise, and sometimes you're surprised for the better, and sometimes not. In the case of all the people you mentioned, I found Bob Dylan, Mick Jagger, and Lou Reed to be extremely gracious and deeply intelligent men. I mean, very knowing. Not always the easiest people to interview because they've been interviewed so much, and part of what they do is not give easy answers, or sometimes not give answers directly at all. But I found a great deal of charm and graciousness and intelligence in all those people. Maybe one of the smartest and most gracious and interesting people I've ever interviewed, I never sat down to write the story about, and that was Leonard Cohen. I think one of the great products of music of the last 30 years, a wonderful songwriter. I think a wonderful singer, though many other people wouldn't agree. But now I'm guessing he's not a laugh riot. You see, Leonard Cohen, he can be very funny. He's a very, very sweet and charming person. He has a
a very gentle sense of humor, but he can be very funny when he wants to be, and he can hit depths that are pretty strong and dark as well.
Anyone who's attended a rock concert in recent years notices the mosh pit down in front. And violence has always been an underpinning of rock in some ways, the Rolling Stones' sympathy for the devil. It goes back quite a long way. That's also a subject that you take a look at in this book, and I haven't really seen it approached by rock writers before the way that you have. What's your perspective on it?
Well, I mean, you know, violence, or what is seen as a kind of violence, goes back to it goes back, well, not only to rock and roll, but you know, all the way through the century. You know, bar fights in blues bars or jazz bars. It became identified as a youth problem in the 1950s when Alan Freed began to hold shows, and when the police became too repressive about what youth could do in those shows or who could get into those shows, the youth reacted by tearing seats up and throwing them around in the stadium. Now, there's a big difference between that and people being killed and people being seriously hurt. You know, I talked to Mick Jagger about that at one point, because the Rolling Stones have this constant shadow of Altamont in their history, the free concert in which a man was stabbed to death in front of the stage as they performed. And he said that his perspective was that if a few chairs get thrown around, if few people shove each other, that is just part of what goes along with it. And his perspective then and now was, that's no big deal. When things are so uncontrolled, when such bad security is provided that people get seriously hurt, when there is some loss, some fundamental loss of civility that erupts in serious damage, then that's another matter. The mosh pit is actually a very controlled little ritual. People do get hurt now and then, but it's almost like a ritualistic sports activity as much as anything.
You also write in various ways about the tension in rock music between the bands you sit down and watch and the bands you stand up and dance to. And it comes out particularly well in an excellent essay that you have on disco, which I found fascinating because disco doesn't get much serious critical attention. It certainly had a lot of influence in popular music, right down to the current electronica, Chemical Brothers style concerts where basically the band is less important than dancing to the band. But you saw disco as almost a reaction to that sit down and watch.
I mean, again, popular music or semi-popular music in this century has been made up of times when the audience was a participant and times when the audience, and actually this is true of classical music as well. At times,
and jazz.
Yes, at times when the audience was a participant or an observer. There were many shows in jazz or in blues where the audience would participate in the sense that they would encourage the performer, and if they liked what the performer was doing, they were more involved and supportive and reactive, and if they didn't like it, they could be more aloof, or they could move over to the next stage and give somebody else their support. And then in the when psychedelic, I mean, there are many other occurrences. Same thing happened with Elvis Presley. In late 1960s, when psychedelia first hit, it was a participant. It was, since it came out of a community, it was kind of a music of participation. People forget that psychedelia began largely as a dance movement in clubs and in auditoriums where people danced and they interacted with the performer on stage. But as people got more attentive to the serious musicianship, to the quality of the lead guitar, then people began to sit and pay attention, and that became that distance between the audience and the performer stayed largely in touch until the mid-1970s, when you saw both disco and punk start to break it down. With disco, it broke it down to the point that there almost never was a performer on stage. There was music being played, and the act of dancing, the act of the people coming together and expressing whatever they were expressing or working out whatever they were working out, that was the performance. And that upset and disturbed a lot of people. I remember a lot of bands saying, we don't have jobs now, we can't go out and play because the audience thinks that they're the star. In the sense that the bands had forgotten that the audience is always the star.
What lesser-known groups, bands, individuals do you have in your CD player these days that people may not have heard about?
Oh, these days I've been listening to, well, I don't know how lesser-known some of these people are to some people. There's a rapper named Master P that I like. I think has a great fluency, a real talent. There's a woman who I know plays here in Seattle from time to time, though she works mostly, I think she lives mostly in Texas or Tennessee, I might be wrong, named Lucinda Williams, a country music writer who I think is one of the major songwriters of our time. She's only made a few albums. She's very, very careful about what she puts out.
She had a benefit album put out for her.
No, that's Victoria.
Victoria.
But they're good friends, and they've worked together a lot. And they actually serve a part of a movement together for a while in Los Angeles. Lucinda is a wonderful singer and a tremendous songwriter, and somebody who really has not come to the light yet that she should. I mean, I could go on and on with many.
Well, there's another take on this question of the groups or individuals who've come out in the last couple of years. Which ones do you think we'll still be listening to in 20, 30 years?
I think that I think we'll still be listening to Bob Dylan in 20 or 30 years, almost an artist reborn. I think Time Out of Mind will be one of those works that will endure for a tremendous amount of time. I think that Tupac Shakur and Notorious Biggie Smalls are artists who will go on to enjoy almost the same kind of stature and reputation, meaning that somebody like Jimi Hendrix went on to endure. And reaching back a few years, obviously a lot of music that came out of the Seattle area and the music that Nirvana made. This is all music that will stand the test of time. And there's plenty of new music, current music. A band like Chumbawamba. I think it's a great single. I think that single will stick around. I bet that even the Spice Girls have a little more life than people expect them to have.
Well, good. We'll have you back in 20 years to talk about that.
Yeah, let's hope.
I have one final question. It's a shadow history of rock and roll. It says right here, Michael, and Frank Sinatra's in it.
Well, for a couple of reasons. Rock and roll to me has always been bigger than rock and roll. It started long before it became rock and roll, and if rock and roll in fact is dead, it will go on long after that. But to me, I grew up with the rock and roll era, and so my perspective for other music it always has rock and roll hovering over it somewhere. To my mind, Frank Sinatra is a rock and roll artist. To my mind, Frank Sinatra was...
Explain that.
Well, he's one of the first punks. He was a man who rose high, became very popular, and had a hard fall, and to rebuild himself at a point in his life when where he was pretty much a forgotten star and a lost hope. And he fought back. He fought back artistically. He fought back in other ways. He created his own turf and defended it.
Frank Sinatra is the first punk. The book is called Night Beat, A Shadow History of Rock and Roll. Mikal Gilmore is the author. We really appreciate you being with us on Upon Reflection.
Thank you.
To see more UWTV classics, visit uwtv.org/classics.